Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to a very special mod with me. Today we are going to be modifying Lisa's Mythic Tarot. So Lisa has had this Mythic Tarot for quite some time, and it's quite worn. And I know she got it used, and she hasn't really connected with it because it's just kind of raggedy looking. And so she had mentioned that she wanted to trim it, and so I offered to trim it for her. So in exchange for me trimming her copy of her Mythic Tarot, she created some wonderful magical gifts for me. Now you can check out Lisa's video on how she created all of this, which is absolutely fantastic, and I've already had the opportunity to watch it so that I could know what all she was sending me. And it was just such a pleasure to watch. I had so much fun watching her process, hearing about how she goes about creating her magical items, because that is something that I definitely want to incorporate more into my practice. And so while I watched that video, I did hold off on opening everything just so that we could open it together. So this is kind of a little bit of a special mod with me, because while we are going to be modifying Lisa's deck, we're going to check out a couple of the magical items that she sent me as well for this little collab that we're doing. And real quick, I'm going to open these little gifts. Now, I do know what these three are because they are in the video. This, however, this was a surprise. So I'm gonna go ahead and open these ones first. Now, what Lisa did was created a special blend for me to assist with my tarot readings and my practice. Now, I know from watching the video that this is a little pouch with, she has some crystals in here, some eggshells, some herbs and things of that nature to be a protective satchel, which is really wonderful. I have to tell you, all this stuff smells so good. It smells so wonderful. Look at all her little cute stickers. So cute. So this she had created was a mister, and it's, I think, meant to be like a room type spray. And I'm really excited to use that because I do actually incorporate that quite often into my practice. So we also have these two, which are the little oil blends that she created. And I believe this is the same blend. And this is a little roller ball one. So you can put it like, you know, on your hands when you're doing tarot work, or when I'm doing tarot work, because she created this blend specifically attuned to me, which was amazing. And oh my gosh, this stuff smells so good. And this one is an oil, so I can use it to like anoint my candles that I sometimes use. What I was after was to create a more sort of intentional magical practice when it came to my readings, and she created a blend that is specific for me. So these I knew were coming because I have, like I said, I've had the chance to watch the process video that she created. This, however, is a surprise. I don't know what Lisa included in here. Oh my goodness, that is so funny. The antiquarian sticker book. The reason it's funny is because this is currently sitting in my Amazon cart. So glad I opened this before I actually ordered. This book is, I've seen pictures of it. It is amazing. It's a sticker book that has like these wonderful vintage style stickers. Hopefully I'm in frame here. Look at how beautiful these are. Oh my goodness. So thank you so much to Lisa for the wonderful book and all of the magical herbal blends that she's created for me, and the little satchel. I will definitely be putting all of this to use. And like I said, if you want to check out Lisa's video on how she created these, which I highly recommend because she talks you through the process and what she's doing and how she incorporates things into these particular practices that she does, and it was really fantastic. So I highly recommend that. I will leave it linked in the description box below. So now that we've had a chance to look at the beautiful gifts that Lisa has created for me, let's move on to modifying her deck for her. So let's go ahead and take a look at Lisa's deck, and look at her Peggy bag. Is that just not the most perfect fit? I think that's wonderful. I just want to show you guys that because beautiful bag. I know that Lisa got this as a very used, well-worn copy of this deck, and you can definitely tell when looking at it. Now, a lot of times we go back and forth about, like, should we trim a out-of-print deck? Because as we know, the Mythic Tarot is out of print. This is the 1986 version, which has the copyright on the back, and it can be a little bit harder to find. And when that's the case, sometimes we go back and forth about whether or not we should trim it. In this particular case, for this particular deck, I would say that trimming it is actually going to give it new life again because it is so worn, because the edges, I don't know if you can see it there, but they are dingy, they are worn, they are chipped, and it is definitely a very well-worn, kind of grungy looking deck. And sometimes we like that look, but sometimes, especially when it's a new to us deck, having it be that worn and chipped kind of just makes it feel like it's just somebody's old used deck, right? It keeps us from making our own personal connection with the deck, which I know has been a case for Lisa, to have it be so well worn that it's almost uninviting to use it. And in these cases, trimming the deck can bring it back to life. It can give it new life. So let's just go ahead and take a little look so that we kind of have a before. You can see here that the edges are very dingy, very dark. If I go this way, you can see that chipping on there. So what we're going to do today is take this gorgeous deck down to the artwork. Hopefully that will give it new life. It will hopefully make those colors pop a little bit more. Because this deck is well used, it is a little bit faded, and I can only tell that because the deck that I have is not quite as used as this one, and the colors are a little bit poppier. But I think once we take all of this excess off of it, we clean it up, we give it a fresh coat on these sides because we are going to edge it as well, I think it's going to make a world of difference for this deck. And I think it's going to help Lisa be able to connect with it. So that is what we are going to do today. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we begin, let's talk tools real quick. I am using the same tools that I use every time I do this now. I have the deck that I'm going to be trimming. I have my Fiskars trimmer. This is a guillotine trimmer. It's my preferred for this type of method. I find that actually this is a fairly thin cardstock, and a slide trimmer would probably go through it okay, but I find the guillotine just makes it a cleaner cut in general when you're cutting cards. Although I do know people who have used a slide trimmer just fine. I have my corner rounder for when we're done to round the corners. And I have my little triangle ruler, and this is my little secret weapon when it comes to making straight edges because it allows me to create a guide. And I have my washi tape to hold it in place. So I'm going to follow the same process that I always do. And as always, there is timestamps in the description box below so that if you don't want to see the how-to process, you can skip right to the end and see the final product. So the first thing that I always do when I'm trimming a deck is I go through and I look for the most challenging card. That would be the card that has a title that gets really close to the border, or the card where the artwork doesn't quite extend, or where the borders are not in the same spot. Now for this particular deck, I don't really see that there being any challenging cards in that respect, particularly because we're not trying to maintain the titles. We're going to be cutting this down just to the artwork. So I'm going to be taking all the titles completely off. So the only thing that I really need to contend with for this particular trim is what is it going to do to our back. And I'm pretty sure that in this instance, we are going to be taking off all of the gold edging around the back of the card. And I always forget a tool every time, right? Every video, I always forget my ruler. That's a tool and I use it every time. And this is of course just approximate. If I trim it right about here, I'm going to lose that top line. And if I go down at the bottom here, I'm going to not only lose the bottom line, but I'm also going to lose the copyright, which granted for some that is a good thing. And trimming the sides should get me down to just hopefully the inside of those lines. So that means that when we're done, my back should look pretty much just like this black background with the emblem in the middle. And that should be all that there is on the back. We're gonna lose all of the decorative line work on the back and the copyright. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is decide which side I'm gonna work on. And for this one, because we are taking all of the sides off, it really doesn't matter. However, I almost always leave the title areas till the last, because then at that point I can decide if that's something that I want to leave on. So I always leave the titles for last. However, I think this deck would look really funny if you left the titles on and took off the 3 sides, but we'll do that last just so we can see it. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this right hand side, and that's just because that's where we are. And I'm going to figure out where I want to make that cut, and then I'm going to set my little marker over here, my little ruler over here, and that's going to create a little guide, a cradle, so that I can cut each of the right sides of this deck at the same measurements. And that's what ensures that you get a really pretty straight, I mean as straight as humanly possible, because like I've said, I'm still human, but as straight as humanly possible to create a nice trim, a nice square deck. So I'm going to slide this up in here, and I'm going to use my little ruler. And as I've mentioned before, the width of this ruler is the same width between the space between my guard here and my blade. And so I just use that to really help me eyeball where that cut is going to be. And I want to maintain as much of the artwork as possible, but I want to make sure that I'm getting off all of that border, right? We don't want to leave any, because then that's going to look a little bit odd. So I am going to line that up, and I'm going to just temporarily tape that down. And this is where my little ruler on this side comes in handy, because making sure that everything is flush, I'm going to now tape this down. Couple things to remember when you're working with really thin cardstock like this, it's really easy for the card to slip under your ruler, so you want to be real careful when you're putting everything in, and you want to make sure that you get everything taped down really well. So I just want to make sure that's down really well. The other thing I like about washi is it comes right off your cards. And I'm liking where that's sitting. And again, I'm being careful that my card doesn't slide up under there. And I'm going to double check over here just to make sure I'm getting off what I need. And we're going to make our first cut. So I go nice and slow and make sure that I am pulling the blade straight down. So there's our first side gone. And I don't know if you can see it there, but I got the slightest little bit of artwork, which is fine because I want to make sure that I'm getting off that black line, the white border, and the excess border on the other side. So now at this point, what I'm going to do is just repeat the process. I'm just going to slip another card in, and I'm going to make sure everything's lined up correctly. I always like to check the first few cards just to make sure, because borders can shift. And I can tell you right now that this image is printed a little bit more to the left than on the full card. And so that means that I'm going to end up taking off more of the artwork in this. And by more, I mean like a sliver. We'll see here. We'll go ahead and take it off and you'll see. The other thing I'm also doing is putting multiple points of contact down on the card to make sure nothing shifts. So you can see here, hopefully, the difference in these two. And that's just because the artwork is printed just a little bit more to the left on the Magician. Now, that doesn't really matter because I am cutting all of these at the same measurements. So that means when I go to flip it around, I just need to make sure that I'm getting the artwork, all of the border removed on the left side as well. And then everything will be at the same size when I'm done because I'm using measurements. So there's that one done. You can see I got even a little bit more, but again, that's because printing is never 100%. But if we look here, and I don't know if it'll show because I've only got 3 cards, but these cards are all cut to exactly the same size. And that's really what we're after. Okay, so I have got all of the right side of the deck cut off. You can see there's no more border there, and it came out pretty nice and flush. So I have reset everything. I turned the deck around. I have reset my measurements and gotten everything set up to cut the other side off. So basically just repeat the process. Set where I want my card, check my measurements, set my little ruler here so I can just pop it in. The other thing I did this time while I wanted to check back in with you was to say that for this particular one, I did check the first card on the top, which was the King of Pentacles, and I did check the very first card that I started with, which was the Fool, just to make sure that my measurements are good, and hopefully that will get it pretty good throughout the rest of the deck. Like I said, it doesn't really matter because I'm using measurements, so they're all going to be the same size. It's just a matter of how much of the art space or artwork that I'm actually taking off versus how much I'm retaining. And so we're going to slip this in here, make our first cut, and there you can see now it's got both sides cut off, and that's what I lost. So just the tiniest bit of the imagery, definitely nothing enough to make any difference in the card itself or in the artwork. So I'm just going to go through and basically repeat this process again, just checking the first few cards just to make sure. And my corner here is popping up a little bit more than I would like it to. So I'm going to tape it down a little bit more, but I'm always making sure that my washi is not impeding in my card area so that it doesn't get in my way, basically. So there we have it. So I have got all of the sides and the two sides and the bottom cut off of this deck. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out. One, will show you the reason why using measurements is important, because on this one you can see that there is very little of the artwork above the white line. I mean, it is just a sliver, but on this one you can see there's quite a bit of it left. You know, a good little sliver there. And when you cut a deck just following the borders that are on the deck itself rather than using measurements, it doesn't account for that. So if I were to cut whatever these two cards that these two slivers came off of, if I were to cut them according to their borders, they would come out different sizes because where the border sits on the card is not 100% the same on every single card. And that's nothing against the printers or anything like that. That's just the way it works for printing, right? They don't all get printed at the exact same time on the exact same run. So let me just show you here because I have at hand, I mean, I always have at hand, but this is my trimmed Llewellyn. And I don't know if you can see here, but let's try to make it lay flat. Hopefully it'll pick up on camera. Everywhere that you see these little shadows, these little divots, that is because I cut this deck according to the border and not using measurements. Now, so this was just pre my measurement days. I hadn't really thought at that point to use measurements to trim my deck so that they all come out the same size. So that means I get these variances where some of the cards are just a little bit larger than others. Now, of course, I love this deck and it's fine. I could totally retrim it, but I haven't because I love it the way it is. But if you compare that to this deck that I just trimmed where it's all flush, it's all nice and even, overall much straighter trim using the measurements. And that's because those border lines, when we follow a deck, cutting it down to the borders, those border lines aren't the same on every single card. There is minuscule differences. And when you're cutting it down and then you try to get them all to lay flat together, that's where you're going to see that is because you're not cutting them at the same exact measurement. So by cutting it at the same exact measurement, we do lose just the tiniest bits of artwork on some cards more than others, but we get this nice flush straight trim for the most part, as I like to say, as humanly possible, because, you know, this is still a hand trimming process. We're not machine cutting here. So it definitely does make a difference. And it also makes a huge difference in the way that a deck will shuffle. When it's nice and straight, it shuffles much better than when it's kind of got cards of different sizes. So before we finish up trimming this deck, I just thought I would show you what it looks like if you were to leave the titles on the top. Now, if I were going to leave the titles on the top, I would take off that little part up there. And then you would just have the title and then this weird blank line. I think that that would be totally doable with this deck, particularly if it's like you want to start with it with the titles on to get to know it, but you want to trim off those other sides. I think that would be perfectly acceptable. The only issue I would see would be in those few places where, like I mentioned, the titles get really, really close to the edge. And once I trim it, if I were to trim that down and then corner around it, I might lose pieces and parts of that title. And if I were going to keep the titles, that would definitely be something to keep in mind. But I think, you know, this deck actually could be made to look pretty nice, just taking that extra top portion off and leaving the titles at the top. It would have been wonderful if these titles would have been at the bottom instead of that weird line. And then the tops maybe just blank and we could have chopped those right off. That would have been great. And that would have made this the perfect little deck to trim down with leaving the titles on the bottom. But as it is, there's a lot of lines. There's a lot of excess stuff going on. And I know that Lisa definitely wants this to be borderless. Again, here we can see with cutting off the two sides, I got into 2 of the letters on the Wheel of Fortune. Now, because we're not keeping the titles on this deck, it's not a big deal. But if you wanted to keep the titles, that would definitely be something to keep in mind. If I were going to trim this deck with the intention of keeping the titles on, I would have used the wheel because it's the longest word. It is the most challenging card because of the length of the title. I would have used that as my reference point. I would have used that as my measurement for all of the sides. That way I would ensure that I could keep the majority of that text as much as possible and not have to worry about the rest of these cards because obviously the text is much shorter. So that's really the only issue. The Knight of Pentacles got really, really close to, but the Wheel of Fortune would be the one to look out for in this deck. Okay, so I have finished trimming and corner rounding this deck. And oh my goodness, it looks so cute. I ended up using the medium size on my corner rounder. Now, I had originally intended to use the small, but when I clipped a couple cards with the small, I realized that that just gave it a little bit too much of a hard edge. And I wanted to soften it up a little bit. So I decided to go ahead and use the medium corner rounder on it. And that's one of the great things about like starting with the smallest and then working your way up, because then if you change your mind a few cards in like I did, I was able to just go back over it with the medium. Now, if I had started with the large and decided, ooh, that's too big, there's nothing I could do about that because you can always take off, but you can't put it back. But look at these cards now. Let me get them back in order here. They're not really in order because I've been, you know, moving them all around, but look how pretty they are without all of that distracting border. Oh my goodness. So excited to do this to my deck. So here's what the backs ended up looking like, which I think look fine. Now, I have been kind of like the whole time in my head trying to think about what do I want to edge this deck in, because I want it to really reflect the energy of the deck, but I also want it to be something that I think Lisa would really like. And so what I decided to do was to try and kind of not only match the back, but match her beautiful Peggy bag, because I love this black and gold swirl. And I happen to have this particular Brilliance stamp pad in lightning black, which is basically a black with gold flecks in it. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and start this process of edging. When I edge with stamps, I didn't get paper towels, so I'm gonna have to do that because generally I cover my table with paper towels so I can lay them out to dry. I do leave the deck out to dry for a good overnight, for a good length of time, usually overnight for me. Now, it's important also when you're using any sort of wet medium, but I do this with markers as well. Anytime I'm edging a deck, I always wipe off the excess every time. That does mean I have to do 2 coats to get it fully saturated, but it also means that I get all the excess off that might have wrapped around. So basically what I'm gonna do is just paint this on here. And I've found that it's better to do a little bit lighter and do more coats than to do a really, really thick coat. I've also had many people ask, can you do more than one card at a time? I do not recommend it because you will get bleed in between your cards unless that is something you specifically, a look that you're specifically going for. And I have done that in the past. I have bulk put a big chunk of cards together, and I have edged a big chunk of them together because I wanted the ink to bleed through and to seep into the front of the cards. That's really just when you're looking for that particular aesthetic. That's the only time I would really recommend that. But you can see here I'm going around and wiping off all of the excess that might have gotten onto the front and back. And it also kind of wipes excess off the sides of the cards and allows it to dry a little bit better. And then you can go back and add that second coat to really darken it up. So I'm gonna go ahead and sit here and watch some videos because that's usually what I do when I am edging a deck, and finish doing, adding the color to this. Maybe we'll do about half. We'll see how my time goes, because it is starting to get a little bit later here and I am going to start losing light. But we'll see how it goes, and maybe we'll check back in at different steps in the process. Okay, so I've got about half the deck edged in the first coat, so I thought we would just take a look. So hopefully you can see there, that is what I've done so far. Well, and what's all drying up here, but I've got about half the deck edged in the first layer, and I think it looks really good. I mean, look at the difference. I think it's a great color match for this particular deck, and I'm really, really liking the way that it's coming on. I'm not sure if I'm going to do more than one coat. I kind of have to wait for the first coat to dry so that I can tell what I need to do moving forward, but I thought I'd just show you kind of this halfway in between point. Okay, I have finished trimming and edging Lisa's Mythic Tarot, and oh my goodness, I think it came out so good. It is so cute. Hopefully the lighting's okay because, you know, it started to get dark here. It's like, what, 5 o'clock, and now it's dark. Into winter. But here is the edging that I ended up doing on it. Hopefully that'll show up okay on camera. It is very much a black gold, which I think looks really fantastic with the backs because it really picks up the gold emblem on the back, but it doesn't like overpower the deck. One of the reasons I didn't want to do like just a plain black was because I didn't want it to sort of make the deck feel heavy or overpowered. So I decided to just go with the sort of black gold color, and I think that it just came out so amazing. They're so cute now, and they definitely feel a little bit more substantial. I did want to just go ahead and do a quick size comparison. So here is Lisa's trimmed deck, and here is my full-size copy. So you can see here that there is quite the size difference now. So you can see there's the sort of artwork. Again, as I mentioned while I was trimming it, you know, you have to kind of take a little bit into the artwork itself. Otherwise, you end up with borders in places that you didn't want borders because the printing is not 100%. Let's pull like let's find the High Priestess card because I think that she's really beautiful in this deck. So you can see hopefully the difference. It's definitely a much smaller deck now, of course, that I've trimmed it. But I feel like it's also like a little bit more intimate, a little bit more closed in. When we trim a deck, we kind of get closer into the figures that are central in the images, and it does make them feel a little bit more personal, a little bit closer up. There is a slight tonal difference between my deck and Lisa's, but I think that a lot of that actually comes down to the fact that Lisa's deck is now not encased in this big yellow border, which gives everything a very yellow tint. And so my deck looks a bit more yellowed now in comparison. And I should have compared them before we started because I personally compared them, not on camera, but I was just looking at the difference between her deck and mine. And her deck actually looked less saturated than mine did. It looked like mine had better, truer colors. But now that I've taken that yellowish border off of Lisa's deck, her deck actually pops more. You know, the whites are more white. It doesn't have this really yellow undertone to it now, which I think is really interesting. And it makes me all the more anxious to get my deck done. So let's take a quick peek here at the Nine of Cups, because I know that's one of Lisa's favorite cards. And you can kind of see where that border has kind of cut into the image a little bit here on this cup, but we definitely get the sense of that cup being in her hand, right? And the cups down here at the bottom got really close. So if we layer these over the top and I put it right here, you can kind of see how much was taken off. And again, that's to account for that variances, those shifts in the printing between cards. But you can see it definitely still retains that energy of the Nine of Cups, and it looks so much cleaner without all this excess around it. There is a slight color tone difference between our two backs as well. And I don't know if, again, that's because I have the gold border around mine, and that may be creating a little bit of that illusion of a color shift. But you can see that the backs look, I think, quite nice without all the extra border, and certainly the copyright. I think it came out so cute. I cannot wait to do mine. And the only reason, the only reason I have held off on doing mine yet is because I knew this deck was coming for me to trim, and I wanted to be able to have some of those cards to compare for you. Let's take a little peek at the wheel real quick, because I think the wheel looks really cool, completely borderless. I could find it in my deck. So I think you can see here that it really does, I think, kind of free the artwork, as we say. It helps the images to really stand out, and I think that it's going to look really beautiful on the table. And let me just pull a couple here so we can maybe see. So you can see here that when I lay a bunch of cards together, you know, we just kind of, there's a lot to distract us from the artwork. There's that big border, there's all the lines, there's the text, there's just a lot of distracting elements that are surrounding each of these images. So now when we see them laid here, we're really focusing in on the artwork, and it's allowing it to really come to the forefront of the reading, whereas before we had all of this border and this text and all these lines that were really distracting. And I think now we can really focus in on that artwork. And actually, because it's borderless now, I can scoot them all together and they could make almost like a story. So there we have Lisa's lovely trimmed copy of the Mythic Tarot. So I'm gonna go ahead and box this back up along with a few other goodies and ship that back to Lisa so that she can enjoy her beautiful trimmed deck. Thank you for joining me for this mod with me. You'll find links for the decks and products that I've used in this video in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this process and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.